The first thing everyone noticed was the silence. Not the pleasant quiet of a zoo at opening hour, but a thick, unnatural stillness that pressed against the glass and made people lower their voices without knowing why. Children who had been laughing moments before slowed their steps. A man stopped mid-sentence. Somewhere behind them, a stroller wheel squeaked too loudly and drew irritated glances. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt the same unease. Something here was wrong. The gorilla enclosure was usually alive with movement. Juveniles tumbled across the grass. Adults paced, groomed, argued softly in their low rhythmic murmurs. But that morning, the entire troop had pulled back toward the far end of the habitat, forming a loose semicircle beneath the shade of a towering rock formation. And at the center of it all stood the silverback. He wasn't moving. He wasn't posturing or beating his chest. He wasn't issuing warnings or asserting dominance. He was simply standing upright, massive arms hanging loosely at his sides, dark eyes locked on a single point beyond the barrier. A little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. She stood close to the glass hands at her sides, her pink jacket slightly oversized, her hair pulled back in a hurried ponytail. She wasn't waving. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't doing anything that should have drawn attention at all. Yet the gorilla's gaze never left her. Minutes passed. The crowd thickened. Phones were raised, then slowly lowered again as people realized something about this felt wrong to record. The silverback did not blink. His breathing was slow, deliberate. His entire presence seemed focused, as if the world had narrowed to a single fragile figure standing on the other side of reinforced glass. Zoo staff noticed too. A keeper near the gate shifted his weight, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt. He had worked with gorillas for nearly 2 decades. He knew their moods, their warning signs, the subtle language of posture and sound that separated calm curiosity from imminent danger. This wasn't any of those. This isn't normal, he muttered under his breath. Gorillas noticed people all the time. They reacted to color, movement, noise. Sometimes they mimicked visitors. Sometimes they ignored them entirely. But this unbroken, unwavering stare was different. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't curiosity in the usual sense. It looked intentional. The girl's mother noticed the attention before anyone else. She felt it the way people feel when they're being watched from behind. Her instinct was immediate and sharp. She stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Sweetie," she whispered, trying to sound calm. "Let's step back a little." The girl didn't move. Her eyes were still fixed on the gorilla, wide but not frightened. If anything, there was a strange seriousness in her expression, as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. "It's okay, Mom," she said quietly. That was when the silverback shifted. A ripple of tension ran through the crowd. The keeper's hand tightened around his radio. Somewhere a child began to cry. The gorilla took a single step forward, slow, controlled, deliberate. The ground beneath his knuckles barely trembled, but the effect was immediate. People stepped back in unison, an unconscious retreat from raw power. The girl stayed where she was. The silverback stopped again, now closer to the glass. Close enough that the lines on his face were visible. The pale scars etched into his dark skin, the intelligence burning behind his eyes. He lowered himself slightly, bringing his face level with the child's. They were staring directly at each other now. Seconds stretched into something heavier. The gorilla's nostrils flared as he inhaled. His head tilted just slightly as if adjusting his view. His gaze softened, not weakened but deepened, carrying something that made the keeper's stomach drop. Recognition. "That's impossible," the keeper whispered. Behind him, a security guard murmured, "Should we clear the area?" "No," the keeper said quickly. Too quickly. Not yet. Because if this was a threat, it was the strangest one he had ever seen. The gorilla wasn't displaying dominance. He wasn't testing boundaries. He was searching. The girl lifted her hand. Her mother gasped, heart slamming against her ribs. But before she could pull her daughter back, the girl pressed her palm gently against the glass. The silverback responded immediately. He raised his massive hand and placed it against the barrier, mirroring the child's gesture with terrifying precision. The size difference was absurd, her small palm swallowed by the shadow of his, but the symmetry was unmistakable. A murmur spread through the crowd. "What is he doing? Is that safe? Why is he doing that?" No one had an answer. The gorilla held the position, unmoving, his eyes never leaving the girl's face. Something in his expression shifted again, subtle but undeniable. The keeper felt it like a punch to the chest. This wasn't an animal reacting to a stimulus. This was a memory waking up. The girl smiled then. Not a wide, playful grin, but a small, knowing smile that didn't belong on someone so young. She leaned closer to the glass and whispered something no one else could hear. The silverback exhaled a deep, rumbling breath that vibrated through the enclosure, like distant thunder. And in that moment, before anyone could intervene, before anyone could explain the truth, settled heavily over everyone watching. This stare was not curiosity. It was not coincidence. And whatever connected that gorilla to that little girl, it had begun long before this day. Ethan Cole had spent 23 years around gorillas, and that was exactly why his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He stood a few meters back from the glass, his radio pressed but silent against his chest, eyes fixed on the silverback, as if looking away might allow something irreversible to happen. Ethan wasn't new to fear. He had faced mock charges, sudden displays of dominance, and the raw power of an animal that could end a human life in seconds without even meaning to. But this quiet, deliberate stillness unnerved him more than any roar ever had. Because gorillas didn't do this. They didn't single out one human from a crowd and lock onto them with unwavering focus. They didn't mirror gestures with such precision. They didn't soften their gaze, tilt their head, or breathe in that slow, grounding way that Ethan recognized from moments of recognition between members of the same troop. That was the problem. Ethan had built his career on understanding patterns. He knew what fear looked like, what curiosity looked like, what agitation sounded like before it became violence. Guerrilla behavior followed rules, complex rules, emotional rules, but rules nonetheless. This shattered all of them. His mind raced through possibilities, discarding each one as quickly as it formed. Was the child doing something imperceptible? A scent? A sound? Something only the gorilla could perceive. Ethan watched the girl closely. She wasn't moving now. She wasn't laughing or crying. She stood calmly, her small hand still resting against the glass eyes, lifted toward the massive face inches away on the other side. She looked familiar with him. That thought made Ethan's stomach tighten. "You seeing this?" murmured a security guard beside him. "I'm seeing it," Ethan replied quietly. Too quietly. His voice didn't sound like his own. He forced himself to breathe, to step into the role he'd trained for. Protocol demanded action distance separation, crowd control. And yet every instinct he had was screaming that intervening right now would be a mistake. The gorilla wasn't escalating. He wasn't agitated. If anything, he seemed anchored by the child's presence, as if her stillness was holding him in place. Ethan glanced at the rest of the troop. They were watching too. That was another thing that didn't fit. The other gorillas weren't alarmed. No chest beating, no vocalizations, no signs of agitation. The females sat quietly, juveniles tucked close, their attention flicking between the silverback and the humans beyond the glass. They trusted him. Whatever he was doing, they accepted it, which meant this wasn't random. Ethan felt the weight of every year he'd spent learning to read animals pressed down on him. Memory stirred uninvited. A night long ago in a rain-soaked forest. A sick gorilla lying still under a tarp. The smell of antiseptic, the tension of waiting to see if a sedative would work. A silverback younger, then thinner, injured, and furious eyes burning with pain and fear. Ethan's jaw tightened. "No," he whispered to himself. "That's impossible." He had been there for rescues, for relocations, for emergency medical interventions. He had looked into many gorilla eyes over the years, but he had never truly believed, that they remembered humans as individuals. Not like this. Not across years. Not across lives that never should have crossed paths again. And yet, standing here now, watching the silverback breathe in the presence of a child who did not belong to his world, Ethan felt certainty creeping in where doubt should have lived. The girl's mother finally broke the spell. "Sir," she said, her voice tight with fear she was trying and failing to control. "Is this safe?" Ethan turned to her. He wanted to offer reassurance, something firm and professional, but honesty pressed harder than comfort. "I don't know," he said. The words landed heavily between them. He knelt slightly, bringing himself closer to the child's level, without breaking line of sight with the gorilla. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The girl turned her head just enough to look at him. Her eyes were calm. Too calm. "Lena," she said. "And you're not scared, Lena?" She shook her head. "He's not mad." Ethan swallowed. "How do you know that?" She looked back at the gorilla. "Because he's sad." A chill ran through Ethan that had nothing to do with the air. Sadness was not an emotion most people were willing to assign to a silverback gorilla, especially one of this size and authority. But Ethan had seen grief in gorillas before. He had watched mothers carry still infants for days. He had seen silence descend over a troop after a loss. He knew that sadness existed here, deep, heavy, and quiet. What he didn't know was why it was focused on this child. "Lena," he said carefully, "have you ever been here before?" She nodded. "A long time ago." Her mother frowned. "No, honey. This is your first visit." Lena didn't argue. She just kept watching the gorilla. Ethan straightened slowly. His heart pounded against his ribs. He was walking a line now, one where logic and instinct were pulling him in opposite directions. Every rule told him to end this interaction, to remove the child from the glass, to restore distance and control. But the gorilla hadn't moved. He was still there, hand against the barrier, eyes fixed on Lena with an intensity that felt almost reverent. When Lena shifted her weight, he adjusted his posture to match a subtle movement that made Ethan's breath hitch. Recognition. That was the word his mind kept circling back to, no matter how much he resisted it. Ethan pressed the radio finally. "Control," he said quietly. "Hold all non-essential movement in this area. I need time." There was a pause on the other end. "Ethan, what's going on?" "I don't know yet," he replied. "But I will." He lowered the radio and rubbed his face with one hand. Doubt gnawed at him. He was a man of science, of observation, of evidence. He knew how dangerous it was to project human narratives onto animal behavior. And yet, the gorilla leaned closer to the glass, his forehead nearly touching it now. His eyes closed briefly just for a second, and when they opened again, Ethan felt something in his chest break open. This wasn't aggression. This wasn't curiosity. This was memory pressing through time, through instinct, through everything Ethan had ever been taught was impossible. And standing there torn between protocol and something far older and deeper, Ethan realized the truth that terrified him most of all. If this gorilla remembered, then whatever came next was already in motion. Lena had always known when fear was expected of her. Adults made fear loud. They widened their eyes, tightened their hands, raised their voices just enough to signal danger without explaining it. Fear to them was something you warned children about in advance, something that lived in rules and signs and red lines painted on the ground. But standing in front of the glass now with the silverback only inches away on the other side, Lena felt none of that. Her heart wasn't racing. Her legs weren't stiff. She wasn't holding her breath. Instead, there was a strange familiarity settling inside her chest, warm and steady like a memory that didn't belong to words. She didn't remember the first time she had felt it, only that it had always been there like a quiet hum beneath her thoughts. It was the same feeling she had when she pressed her ear to her mother's chest at night, as a baby, the same calm that came when she closed her eyes and listened to rain hit the roof. The gorilla's eyes were large and dark, but they weren't sharp. They weren't searching her the way humans did, looking for explanations or mistakes. They simply rested on her, heavy and patient, as if he had all the time in the world to remember her properly. Lena lifted her hand again slowly, not because she thought she should, but because it felt right. The glass was cold beneath her fingers. On the other side, the silverback shifted his massive shoulder, rolling forward with deliberate care. He didn't rush. He didn't test the barrier. He only moved until his knuckles aligned with where her palm rested, separated by nothing but transparency and distance that could not be crossed. That was when Lena smiled. She didn't know why adults were whispering behind her. She didn't know why her mother's voice trembled when she said her name. None of that mattered. What mattered was the quiet between her and the gorilla, a silence that felt shared, mutual, complete. "You're still here," Lena whispered. She wasn't sure who she meant, him or herself. The silverback exhaled a deep sound that vibrated through the glass and into her bones. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a warning. It was a release, like the sigh her mother made when she finally sat down after a long day. Lena leaned closer. Ethan saw it and felt panic surge, but it stalled halfway to action. Every part of him screamed to intervene to pull the child back to restore the distance that had always kept humans safe. But his body refused to move, because the gorilla did not react with tension. He softened. That was the only word Ethan could find for it. The silverback's posture loosened, his weight settling back into his haunches. His breathing slowed. The massive power coiled in his frame did not disappear, but it rested contained, held in place by something Ethan could not measure or explain. Recognition again. Lena's mind drifted not away from the moment, but deeper into it. Images surfaced without shape or order. Green shadows, the smell of wet leaves, a deep rumble that had once felt frightening until it didn't. She remembered small hands clutching coarse fur, remembered warmth and movement, remembered being carried when walking had been too much. She did not remember pain. She remembered safety. "I know you," she said softly. Her voice barely reached the glass, but the silverback's eyes changed all the same. His brow lowered, his gaze narrowing in a way that was not aggression, but focus, as if he were reaching inward, searching through layers of time and instinct. A memory answered, not in pictures or names, but in sensation. He remembered the night rains soaked through his fur and into his wounds. He remembered the sting of metal, the panic, the heat of infection burning through his body. He remembered the weight of the world pressing down until movement became agony. And he remembered small hands, not the same ones, not this child's hands, but human hands that did not hurt, hands that cleaned wounds instead of making them, hands that trembled with care, hands that stayed when they could have left. He remembered a human voice low and steady in the darkness, a presence that did not challenge him, did not fear him, did not demand anything at all. That memory lived in him, now stirred awake by the stillness of a child who looked at him without threat or expectation. The silverback shifted again, lowering himself until his chest rested against the ground. It was a vulnerable posture, one that no gorilla took lightly, especially not in front of watching eyes. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lena felt the shift like a gift. She sat down too, crossing her legs on the cool concrete floor, her palms still pressed to the glass. Her reflection merged with his shadow, two shapes meeting at the boundary between worlds. "You don't have to be sad anymore," she said. Ethan felt his breath catch painfully in his chest. Children weren't supposed to say things like that. They weren't supposed to sense emotions in animals this way, weren't supposed to understand grief that even adults struggle to articulate. And yet the gorilla's eyes closed again, slower, this time longer. The troop responded in kind. The females settled. The juveniles stilled. A quiet fell over the enclosure, heavy and complete, as if the entire space had decided to listen. Lena's mother knelt beside her, tears sliding freely now, but she did not pull her daughter away. Something in the air told her that doing so would break more than safety protocols. It would break something fragile and rare. "Lena," she whispered, "are you okay?" Lena nodded. He remembers. Remembers what sweetheart she thought about that. He remembers being helped, she said finally, and he remembers being alone. The words hit Ethan with physical force, because that was it. That was the thread running through everything, the reason this moment felt so heavy, so intimate, so irreversible. It wasn't about dominance or curiosity or coincidence. It was about memory and meaning, crossing a boundary that science insisted was solid. The silverback opened his eyes again and looked directly at Ethan this time, not as a threat, as acknowledgement. Ethan felt something unspool inside him, a belief he hadn't realized he still carried. That animals forgot, that kindness was fleeting, that moments like the one he had lived years ago in the forest had ended when he walked away. He had been wrong. The gorilla turned back to Lena, lifting one massive finger and pressing it gently against the glass, exactly where her hand rested. They stayed that way for a long time. No movement, no sound, no fear. Just a child who felt safe where fear should have lived, and an animal who remembered that safety had once been given to him freely without condition. And in that shared stillness, something old and enduring took shape, proof that not all bonds required language, and not all courage looked like strength. Sometimes it looked like trust. Long after Lena's small hand left the glass, long after the murmurs of the crowd softened into uneasy silence, something remained suspended in the air of the enclosure. It was not excitement. It was not fear. It was the quiet weight of recognition settling where certainty had once lived. Ethan felt it as he stood there motionless, his eyes never leaving the silverback. He had spent his career surrounded by facts, measurable behaviors, documented patterns, peer-reviewed conclusions. He had taught students that animals lived in the present, that memory served function, not sentiment, survival, not story, instinct, not reflection. But the gorilla did not move like a creature trapped in the moment. He remained where Lena had been, his knuckles still pressed against the glass, as if the space she occupied had not yet cooled. His breathing was slow, deliberate. His eyes, when they opened, were not scanning for threat or food or dominance. They were inward, focused on something no one else could see. Memory. Ethan's chest tightened, not with wonder, but with discomfort. Because if this was memory, real memory, layered and persistent, then it challenged the architecture of everything he had been taught to believe. Not metaphorical memory, not conditioned response, but something closer to recollection, to association, carried across time without reward. He remembered the night in the forest years ago with startling clarity now. The rain, the smell of blood and wet earth, the gorilla lying stiller than death should allow, breath, shallow eyes dulled by pain. Ethan remembered the moment he should have left, when protocol had demanded distance, when fear would have been justified. He had stayed. Not because he expected gratitude, not because he believed the animal would understand. He stayed because leaving felt wrong in a way he could not explain. And now, standing here, he wondered whether the gorilla had felt the same. The staff began to move again, quietly, cautiously. Radios crackled with low voices. Someone mentioned safety procedures, crowd control, the necessity of restoring normal viewing patterns. But none of it reached the silverback. He shifted at last, rising slowly, every movement controlled, deliberate. The power in his body did not recede, but it no longer dominated the space. Instead, he turned and walked to the far edge of the enclosure, not retreating, not avoiding, simply repositioning himself where he could see everything at once. He sat and waited. Ethan understood then that the moment was not over. It had simply changed shape. Over the following days, the footage spread far beyond the zoo's walls. Grainy phone recordings, security camera angles, slowed clips dissected frame by frame. Commentators argued, experts debated, skeptics dismissed it as projection, coincidence, human emotion imposed onto animal behavior. But the silverback did not care about interpretation. Each morning when the gates opened, he positioned himself in the same place. Each afternoon when Lena returned, sometimes with her mother, sometimes with her father, sometimes holding Ethan's hand, he noticed immediately. Not with urgency, with certainty. He never approached the glass quickly. He never pressed or tested it. He simply aligned himself with her presence, adjusting his posture to face her, lowering himself when she sat, standing when she stood, matching her rhythm without mimicry. It was not training. It was acknowledgement. Ethan watched it all, documenting where he could, restraining himself where he must. His notes became more fragmented, less confident. Words like association and habituation began to feel thin, insufficient to hold what he was witnessing. Because the memory the gorilla carried was not attached to reward. Lena did not feed him. She did not perform tricks. She did not return consistently enough to form routine. And yet he remembered her absence as clearly as her presence. On days she did not come, he waited. The staff noticed first. The gorilla would settle near the glass and remain there longer than usual, eyes alert but unfocused, as if listening for something that had not yet arrived. When closing time came, he did not resist leaving the space, but he left slowly, reluctantly, pausing once to look back. Ethan had never seen an animal look back that way. The child noticed too. "Why does he wait?" Lena asked one evening as they walked away. Ethan searched for an answer that would not betray the truth he was still learning to accept. Maybe, he said carefully, he remembers how it feels when someone doesn't leave. Lena nodded, satisfied. She seemed to understand in ways adults often failed to. As weeks passed, patterns emerged too consistent to dismiss. The silverback remembered sounds, the cadence of Lena's footsteps, the pitch of her voice. He remembered gestures, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she pressed her palm flat instead of tapping. He even remembered Ethan. When Ethan approached alone, the gorilla acknowledged him with a steady gaze. No movement, no tension. Not friendliness, recognition. as if the memory of one human had opened a door through which another could now stand. The past, it seemed, did not fade for him. It layered. Ethan began to read studies late into the night work on elephant mourning, on corvid memory, on primates who recognized caretakers decades later. He had read these papers before taught them even, but now they felt different, no longer theoretical. Now memory had weight. It could slow a step. It could soften a posture. It could turn power into restraint. One afternoon when Lena was sick and unable to visit the silverback, refused food for hours. Not entirely, just enough to unsettle his keepers. He sat near the glass still and patient until closing time. When Ethan approached speaking softly, the gorilla turned his gaze to him, then back to the empty space where Lena usually stood. Ethan felt his throat tighten. "I know," he murmured. "She'll be back." The gorilla did not react. But the next day when Lena returned pale and quiet, he was already there. The memory had held. That was when Ethan understood the true danger of what they were witnessing. Not physical danger, but conceptual. Because if animals remembered kindness not as stimulus, but as experience, then humanity's relationship with the natural world was built on a lie far more fragile than he had ever realized. It meant harm lingered too. It meant abandonment did not vanish. It meant every act left a trace. The silverback rose as Lena approached, then settled again, careful not to crowd the glass. Lena smiled faintly and leaned her forehead against it, eyes closed. "I'm here," she whispered. The gorilla exhaled slow and deep. Ethan stood back, tears blurring his vision, not from joy but from the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. This memory, this impossible, undeniable memory, was not a miracle to be celebrated lightly. It was a truth to be reckoned with. Because if animals could carry memory like this, then they were not passive participants in the world humans built around them. They were witnesses. They were survivors. They were keepers of moments humans preferred to forget. And standing there watching a child and a gorilla share a silence shaped by time, Ethan knew that nothing about his work would ever be simple again. The past was alive, and it was watching back. When the staring stopped, nothing returned to normal. At first it seemed as though the moment had simply ended. The crowd dispersed. The glass was cleaned. Schedules resumed. Visitors flowed past the enclosure again, talking, laughing, lifting phones for quick photos before moving on. On the surface, the zoo reclaimed its familiar rhythm. But beneath that rhythm, something had shifted. Ethan noticed it in the way the silverback carried himself afterward. The gorilla no longer positioned himself at the center of the enclosure during peak hours where dominance was usually displayed and reinforced. Instead, he chose the edges, the quiet places where he could observe without being observed. His movements were slower, more deliberate, as if the world required a different kind of attention now. This was not withdrawal, it was adjustment. The silverback ate, slept groomed, and interacted with his troop as before, but there was a subtle restraint in his behavior that had not existed previously. Displays of force were fewer. Corrections within the group were softer. Even play seemed measured, as though something fragile had been introduced into his awareness, something that demanded care. Ethan documented what he could, though his notes grew increasingly inadequate. The language of science resisted what he was witnessing. There were no terms precise enough to capture an animal recalibrating its presence in the world after recognition, because that was what it felt like. Recognition had occurred, and recognition carried consequences. Lena returned less frequently after that first week. School resumed. Life reasserted itself. When she did come, she no longer stood frozen in front of the glass, transfixed by the gorilla's gaze. Instead, she waved briefly, sometimes smiling, sometimes distracted as children often are. The staring did not resume, but the connection did not dissolve. The silverback always noticed her arrival. Even from the far side of the enclosure, even when his back was turned, he registered the change. He did not rush forward or press against the glass. He simply oriented himself so she remained within his field of vision. That was enough. Ethan realized slowly and uncomfortably that the staring had never been the point. It had been the opening, not the bond itself. The silence that followed was where the meaning settled. Time passed. Weeks became months. The footage stopped circulating, replaced by newer stories, louder spectacles. The world's attention moved on, as it always did. Only a few researchers continued to inquire, asking careful questions, requesting access to data that never quite supported the conclusions they wanted to draw. Ethan declined most interviews, not out of secrecy, but out of humility. He no longer trusted himself to explain what had happened without reducing it to something manageable, something falsely contained. Because whatever had passed between a child and a gorilla did not belong to the world of spectacle. It belonged to memory. He began to see it everywhere after that, in the way elephants paused at the bones of their dead, in the way older chimpanzees returned to the same sleeping sites year after year, in the way animals once harmed carried caution long after danger had passed. Memory was not an anomaly, it was a foundation. The silverback aged visibly over the following year. His movements stiffened slightly. His naps grew longer. Leadership within the troop shifted in subtle ways as younger males tested boundaries and learned restraint through example rather than force. And still the silverback remained present. When Lena grew taller, when her voice deepened, when she began to stand with a confidence that replaced childhood softness, he adjusted to that too. His gaze no longer searched for the small girl who once stood inches from him. It acknowledged the person she was becoming. Recognition did not freeze time, it evolved with it. One afternoon, long after the staring had stopped entirely, Ethan watched Lena stand at the glass with her father. She spoke quietly, explaining something he could not hear. The silverback lay several meters away, half asleep, his back turned. Then Lena laughed. The sound was sharper, now older. Different. The gorilla opened his eyes. He did not turn fully. He did not rise. He did not approach. He only tilted his head slightly, just enough to place her in his peripheral vision. Ethan felt his breath catch. The memory had not been visual alone. It was layered with sound, with presence, with something far more durable than a single image. That night, Ethan stayed late, sitting alone near the enclosure after the zoo closed. The silverback approached the glass once more, slowly stopping short of it. He sat heavy and grounded, looking not at Ethan, but at the faint reflection of the trees beyond the barrier. Ethan spoke without expecting an answer. "She's growing," he said quietly. The gorilla remained still. "I think you knew that would happen." The gorilla shifted his weight, exhaled, and closed his eyes. Ethan understood then that the story did not end with amazement or disbelief. It ended with responsibility. Because once recognition existed, indifference was no longer possible. The silverback had not crossed a boundary that day. He had revealed one, a boundary humans had invented to excuse their distance. In the years that followed, Ethan changed how he taught. He spoke less about control and more about continuity, less about dominance, hierarchies, and more about shared histories. He challenged students to consider not what animals could do, but what they might carry. Not every student agreed, not every colleague approved, but Ethan no longer needed certainty. He had seen what happened after the staring stopped. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just a life quietly altered by the knowledge that memory could pass between worlds without permission. And that knowledge stayed. It stayed in the silverback's careful restraint. It stayed in Lena's unspoken calm when she stood near the glass. It stayed in Ethan's refusal to look at animals as if they were empty of past. The staring ended. The remembering did not. And somewhere between a child and a gorilla, the world became just a little harder to simplify. Some stories don't end with a roar, a rescue, or a moment meant to go viral. Some stories end quietly, and that is exactly why they stay with us. This story is not really about a gorilla or a child or even a moment of staring that defied logic. It is about something far deeper: recognition. The kind that doesn't demand words, the kind that doesn't need proof, the kind that changes behavior long after the moment itself has passed. One of the most powerful lessons here is that intelligence and memory are not exclusive to humans. For centuries, people have drawn lines between species, between instinct and emotion, between us and them. We have used those lines to justify control, exploitation, and emotional distance. And yet again and again, nature quietly erases them. Not through violence, not through spectacle, but through moments of connection that science struggles to fully name. The gorilla did not act out of training. He did not perform. He did not seek attention. He recognized something familiar, something meaningful, and responded in the only way that mattered: by remembering. And in doing so, he forced every human who witnessed that moment to confront an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps animals are not as separate from us as we want to believe. Another lesson is about presence. The child did not scream. She did not run. She did not project fear onto the moment. She simply existed open, unguarded human, and that openness became a language of its own. Sometimes the bravest thing we do is not to act, but to stay present when instinct tells us to retreat. For the adults watching the experience reshaped responsibility. Once you witness awareness in another being, you can no longer treat that being as an object. You can no longer pretend indifference is harmless. Knowledge creates obligation. Recognition demands respect. This story also teaches us that not every transformation is dramatic. The most meaningful changes are often subtle, a shift in behavior, a softening of force, a quieter way of moving through the world. Growth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply stays. And perhaps the most important message of all is this: compassion does not weaken nature, it reveals its depth. Strength is not only measured in dominance or power, but in restraint, memory, and choice. When a being capable of great force chooses stillness, instead, that choice matters. Stories like this remind us why we tell animal stories in the first place. Not to romanticize wildlife, not to humanize animals unfairly, but to understand that empathy is not a uniquely human trait, it is a shared one. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see the natural world a little differently, that means its purpose was fulfilled. And there are many more stories like this waiting to be told, stories about loyalty, memory, courage, and the invisible threads that connect lives across species. Subscribe to the channel to support more meaningful animal stories like this. Your support gives us the motivation to keep searching, keep listening, and keep sharing moments that remind us who we are and who we could be. Because sometimes the most powerful stories don't shout, they stay.